We didn't put this after because it's 8:05, so that's when people start gathering for our thing, so we'll sort of wrap up before then. Okay, we are up to Roman numeral 4, right? Letter. Did we do letter I? We do 6 microwave dishwashers. We did that last time?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Did we do J? We did J also then, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's do K. Letter K. Okay, so Roman numeral 4, letter K. There are quite a few additional mitzvot, additional commandments in the Torah that pertain only to agriculture in the land of Israel, and so produce from the land of Israel has a whole series of additional steps to make sure it's kosher. There are tithes that have to be taken, and rules about how the land is treated, and the sabbatical year, and several other relevant mitzvot that pertain to Israel, agriculture of the land of Israel. From the point of view, so if you're a farmer, you have to learn a lot of these rules. From the point of view of a consumer, it means you can't assume that fruits and vegetables from Israel are kosher unless and they require rabbinic supervision. So in the diaspora, in America, you can get an apple anywhere, and you can get fruits and vegetables anywhere without having any real kashrut concerns. In Israel, that's not true, and Israeli produce, that's not true. When it comes to if you happen to be in a supermarket in Israel, you should look for kosher certification of the supermarket, of the produce section of the supermarket. This is not hard to find. Most of this is generally taken care of at the wholesale level by the big fruit and vegetable suppliers in Israel. So it's not hard to find these kashrut certifications if you're in a supermarket or a marketplace in Israel, but it is something to look for, unlike the United States. And it means if you go visit your cousin, on the kibbutz, and they give you a big crate of grapefruit, it's not kosher, right? Because it's not kosher because tithes have to be taken before it can be eaten. And if you find, sometimes peppers from Israel are sold in Chicago certain times of the year, and those also can't be assumed kosher. You have to separate tithes from them, or unless it's been, you can't assume that it was done for the produce of the export. It's done almost routinely for all the produce that is used for domestic Israeli consumption. The produce they export, they don't necessarily do this. So you can do it yourself, and a good siddur will give you instructions on how to do it. I think the current siddur has instructions on how to tithe produce. Once upon a time, this is how the Kohanim, the priests in the temple, were fed, and the Leviim, the Levites who served in the temple, this is how they fed. They weren't farming themselves; they were serving in the temple, and so tithing was how they got food. The farmers would separate some of their produce and give to the priests and to the Leviim, the Levites. We don't have priests and Levites serving in that capacity, so it doesn't have that same function as it once did, but there's still that obligation still exists. So Israeli produce has to be tithed, and a few other relevant mitzvot as well. So I guess from the point of the consumer, if you go to Israel, you have to be a little bit more careful in fruits and vegetables that you eat, and make sure that there's a good kosher certification of the produce section of the supermarket. You'll see a sign hanging on the wall, etc. Questions on that? Okay. L. Let's see. So insects are not kosher. We discussed that already. That means that insects have to be removed from food as well. Normally, very small things, we just say they'd be nullified in 60 times their volume. Insects that are intact are not nullified, because intact organisms are not nullified even in many times 100 times, 1,000 times their volume. And so even small insects have to be removed if you can see them. If they're invisible, then microscopic, certainly have to remove them. If they're visible, you do have to remove, even if it's not so easy to see them. So there's just some processes necessary to make sure that there aren't insect infestations of your food, particularly like leafy greens, or broccoli, or I think with lots of places for small bugs and flies to crawl in and hide, or worms, whatever. There's a need to check. The way I generally do it, I put them in a big bowl of cold water. I add a little bit of vinegar, which just stun the bugs, and then I shake it and rinse it, and rinse that very vigorously. And I check the water to see. Sometimes you'll see little floating insects, and then you do it again, and then you don't. I usually don't find too many insects in most of the food I buy. Sometimes you get a batch of whatever it is that's particularly infested, and it's important to wash it as much as is necessary until you remove all those little insects. Again, something that's invisible is, to the naked eye is not a concern. Something that is visible, then it's not going to be nullified, then it's not kosher, it has to be removed from your vegetables. And this is, again, another reason why it's, I guess even in diaspora, this is a reason why you have to be a little more careful with certain like fruits and vegetables, like a salad bar or something, like they might not be checking everything quite as rigorously as we would require. Questions about that? Okay, 2, Orla. First 3 years after a tree is planted, the fruit is not kosher. We don't have to be concerned about that for like fruit we buy, because I think we just assume that it is not Orla. I think the trees are not really so productive at that stage of their development. But so as a consumer, this is not something that's Orla. But if you have a tree that's planted, you plant a tree in your backyard, you have to make sure at least 3 years. For the first 3 years, the fruit is not kosher. 4, Yasha. Grain that grows, wheat grains have to, growing in the field, or that have actually been harvested already and are just waiting in a granary, whatever, aren't kosher until the second day of Passover. There was a special sacrifice, a grain sacrifice that was offered, brought in the temple times on the second day of Passover, that made permissible to eat all of the grain that was sort of the new grain that had not, that was sort of either still on the stalks in the fields or in storage. Only old grain can be eaten, not this new grain. This applies in Israel. It also seems to apply outside of Israel as well, and this is also seems to be a concern that we should have. Nonetheless, the last, 500, 800 years, the practice in diaspora is not to be concerned about this particular prohibition, based on the assumption that probably the grain that we're eating is not new anyway. It's probably, it's processed for a while, it's held in storage for a while, and it's not this new grain. And maybe even, perhaps this mitzvah only pertains to produce of the land of Israel anyway. But there are many people who are strict about this, and they check UPC codes before eating cereal to find out when the grain was actually grown for that box of Cheerios during the relevant times of the year. And there are certain bakeries you'll see that are advertised as Yashan bakeries. That means that only the flour is from before that second day of Passover, right? It's not new. It wasn't planted after Passover, like some summer crop. You'd have to wait until the next year before that grain can be eaten. It used to never be. It used to, the United States, they used to have, the government used to manage vast storehouses of surplus grain. That was the way they, President Roosevelt supported farmers by instituting a program. The federal government would buy surplus grain and then would sell it during times of scarcity. And in this way, they would manage a stable price for grain. So farmers would have a stable, predictable price that earned them a modest but reliable profit, and consumers also had, didn't have to worry about shortages of grain. And this was managed from the 1930s until President Nixon, who replaced that system with direct subsidies to farmers, where the government would say, we will guarantee you $5 per whatever quantity of grain, and no matter how much you grow, we'll guarantee you that price. And this changed the incentives of farmers to just grow as much as they possibly could, because they were guaranteed a set price, even from the government. The government would make up the difference between the market price and the price that they set. So the farmers are still getting the same modest and reliable income, but the market price for grains that are in this program drops dramatically, because the farmers are now producing as much as they possibly can with modern fertilizer and modern pesticides and satellite-guided, combines. So the price of grain, if you're a industrial food producer, if you're Nabisco or whatever, if you're making corn syrup or cookies or bread in a factory, you can get grain for very, very, very cheap with this way. Farmers still getting this, whatever. And there's no longer this stage where the federal government was maintaining these grain storage. So it also means that there's now all sorts of ways that impacts the food we eat. This is also when farm animals moved indoors and started being fed grain, because it's now so cheap to feed, just corn to cows and chickens and, right, and pigs and everything. So it really changed the way we eat and what we eat. And it means that now some of the, like, there's more of like this yashan concern now. So there are people, again, some big kosher bakeries will advertise in addition to being kosher, they are yashan, that they're very careful about the grain they use because of this prohibition. But it's not, it still remains a sort of basic accepted practice not to be concerned about this, and you can get regular flour. So. 5, the Torah says that when we make a dough, we have to separate a certain amount. This is called to separate challah, and this was in ancient times was given to the priests. So this is also a way that they would eat. They were serving in the temple. They weren't farming, so they would eat. Every time anybody made some dough, they would take a separate piece out and portion out and give it to the priests. We no longer have priests who are capable of eating this challah because they're not maintaining themselves in a state of purity, and so it's just burned. But if you make dough, a portion should be separated and placed inside the oven and burned and then discarded. And if you make if the quantity of grain is sufficiently large, I don't know how many ounces or it is, but you can look this up, then a blessing is said over this mitzvah separating challah. And if it's less than that, then you would do it without saying the blessing. The blessing requires a certain quantity, but the mitzvah should be done in any case. My wife makes challah very often. Her standard recipe is not a sufficient amount of flour to separate the challah dough with a blessing, so she just separates it without a blessing as she's making her, challah loaves, and then puts it aside. Now, we use the word challah conventionally to refer to special bread prepared for Sabbath and holidays, but actually, specifically, technically, challah is that dough that's separated out from your big batch of dough to separate challah. I'm making dough because I'm making a baguette, I'm making focaccia, I'm making whatever, ciabatta roll, okay, whatever it is, okay, sourdough. I have to separate, that's called hafrish challah min ha'isa, to separate challah from the dough. That's the mitzvah. So challah really refers to the portion that is separated, that you don't eat, that gets burned and discarded. That's actually what challah means. Technically, we use it colloquially to refer to the braided breads that we make for Shabbat and holidays. The Shemitah year, the sabbatical year, has many restrictions on agriculture in the land of Israel, and the way different types of agricultural labor is forbidden, and the buying and selling of the produce that grows on its own during the sabbatical year is forbidden, and finding food in the land of Israel, in Israel during the Shemitah year is a challenge. We have, I think, another 4 or 5 years until the next sabbatical year, so it's not like an urgent thing to know about, but if you find yourself in Israel during a Shemitah year, or even just after a Shemitah year, it's a pretty cool thing. There's lots of special mitzvot to learn about and how you get your food, and there are great books that have been written about how to do this. I edited one some years ago, so I can vouch for that. Here it is, Ramon Shvita. It's on the street. So if you find yourself in Israel, it's a wonderful opportunity to engage in this mitzvah as a consumer. And so study that then. For a consumer in America, I think it's not. I don't think it really impacts too much. Any questions? I said so far, so we've gone through a lot of topics very quickly. All set?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. M, feel like Caleb, okay? Kitchen utensils. Utensils used for meals, okay? So that means forks and knives and pots and pans that come in direct contact with food that's then eaten need to be brought to the mikveh before they're used, if they're made by someone non-Jewish. As these pots and pans, forks, knives, spoons are brought into a kosher kitchen, when the possession goes from someone not Jewish to someone Jewish, they should be brought to a mikveh, immersed in the mikveh. It's almost like a conversion ceremony for the utensils. That's sort of how I kind of think about it, just as our Jewish lives are, the food we eat is very relevant to living a Jewish life, and so therefore the things that we use to make our food also have to, as it were, be Jewish, right? So they're brought. So unless we make them ourselves, they're brought to the mikveh before they're used. Anything made of metal, this is done, right? Porcelain. Some people immerse porcelain. I think more common. I think it's not necessary. Porcelain China does not have to be immersed in the mikveh. glass we do immerse, but we don't say blessing on glass. But things that are metal we bring to the mikveh and immerse in the mikveh before their use, unless they were made by someone Jewish, which could happen, I guess. If you have an aluminum pan that's disposable and you decide you want to use it more than once, so then maybe that could be defined as someone Jewish decided making it into a vessel by making that decision to turn it into a multiple use tool, right? As opposed to something one time, but so.
Why isn't porcelain?
I think because I think it's assumptions about it. Porcelain is like fine china is not porous, so we're not very porous, and so we. I think that's part of it. Oh no, sorry. It has to do. I think it has to do with just susceptibility to ritual impurity. I think that's actually why. So metal is like a thing that is. No, of course, China is also so. I don't remember. It's a very fair question. That's a very good question. I don't remember the answer. Why some things require immersion and some don't. It actually comes up. It's described last week's Torah question. Described some of the. No, it's this week's Torah question. This week's Torah question describes actually. It's next week's Torah question. Right after we make military campaign against Midian, they capture lots of their pots and pans. So the Torah describes how they're kosher. So there's like the koshering process, which is removing the taste of non-kosher foods, and then there's the we have to bring them into the community by like a conversion also. So that's bringing them to a mikveh. So many mikvehs will have like a separate, smaller mikveh for dipping your pots and pans and forks and knives, that's like attached to the mikveh that a person would use. The requirements are the same, but this would be a mikveh of like much, of like the smallest possible size for a mikveh. We use that for pots and pans, and have a separate entrance, a separate access point, and so ours is a separate entrance. So actually entering it during the daylight hours, 6 days a week, we can go and access our mikveh for utensils, for pots and pans and forks and knives, and that's where you buy something new before it's used. That's where you bring it.
Is there a mikveh around there?
Yeah, the shul has a mikveh. Our mikveh meant the shul has a mikveh. There's one at the back of the shul.
Wow.
That's a cylinder.
It's that modern appendage to the shul building is the mikveh. So there's a personal mikveh there, which is used every night of the week, and then there's also it's like the same pit of rainwater, but there's also like a separate smaller place where you can immerse your pots and pans.
Now, if you have pot or any utensils that aren't kosher, and you should probably kosher them first before bringing them to a mikveh.
I think so. I'm not sure it matters. I think it's big. I actually don't think it matters, but may as well kosher them first, I guess. But they're just kind of separate, right? Because this is not about kosher, non-kosher. This is just like a separate mitzvah to bring our pots and pans and forks and knives to the mikveh before we use them. So it's a little bit different. There's some overlap, but similar concepts, but they're different.
Yeah.
It's an interesting kind of discussion of whether somebody who converts to Judaism has to bring her things to the mikveh.
I had that question.
So some say anyway. So on one hand, you have all these things that were owned by someone not Jewish. So now they're owned by someone Jewish. You have to bring it to the mikveh. On the other hand, they were never acquired from someone non-Jewish to someone Jewish. They just became owned by someone Jewish when the person who owned them, the same person, became Jewish, right? So there are different opinions on that. I think the CRC here recommends bringing to the mikveh, but not saying it for blessing. That's their guidance, but they're different opinions. So one last. Let's wrap up this section. Letter O. What is a reliable hechsher? So I think I used that word. Hechsher means a certification. That means that an organization has gone to either the restaurant, the supervising the restaurant, or and says that it's kosher, or the product, and has put a symbol on the can, right? Outside in the lobby, we have a list of quote unquote reliable agencies that supervise restaurants and consumer goods as being kosher. What do I mean by reliable? So there are a couple of ways that something could not be reliable. One is they're honest people, they're very decent, they have integrity, but they have some maverick opinions about some matters of Jewish law as pertains to kosher food, and our practice is not to rely on, not to accept those maverick positions. Great people, decent people, it's not a reliable hechsher for our community because they adopt, there's some maverick positions that they have. Their son kosher agencies that fall into that category. Second, they could be honest people, reliable people with integrity. They're just incompetent at managing something so complicated as supervising a big catering business or a big factory. They don't have the knowledge of food science, of how industrial food works, or they're just not project management, right? They don't know how to, a caterer who's like a little bit unscrupulous could run circles around these guys because they just don't have the operation to get, they don't have the operational capacity, the bandwidth to really monitor and be on top of like everything that's going on. So they're good people, but there are agencies that fall into that category. Third is they could just be they're scoundrels and they're just trying to make money, in a way that seems easy for them because they can convince somebody that they're a rabbi, and maybe they are, but they have agencies like that as well. And so when we say these are not reliable, it could be they have maverick positions or elected positions. They're good people, decent people, have a reliable system set up in place to monitor, but some of their opinions are like not what we accept in our community from various issues of Jewish law, so we're not going to consider it. Or good people with integrity, but they don't have the competency to really, again, you have to know like the Jewish law very well, and also you have to know like industrial food science really well, and the industry. This is a very complex process, and also like be a little bit savvy if you're going into a restaurant or a catering business. Like you got to make sure that like you're on top of what they're doing and they're not doing things on the side without your knowledge. And then there are some unscrupulous actors who are just not providing much supervision at all, and that unfortunately exists as well. So we have a pretty expansive list of reliable agencies that are on our sheet, and those are great. And the ones that are not, I think, are best avoided for the various reasons that I listed. I think we'll pause here. Okay, we're done. We're just wrapping up. If you want to stay for a minute, you're welcome to. That's going to begin in 5 minutes or 6 minutes.